Ten Shikiwa, hello, how are you all? Welcome to Homelands, originally broadcast on CFCR Community Radio, 90.5 FM in Saskatoon, Homelands of the Métis and Treaty 6 Territory, CFCR.ca. This is your favorite auntie, Andrea Letting Dishni Kashun. My name is Andrea Letting, call me Auntie Andy if you like, and I'll be your host over this next half hour. I am part settler, part relative, and 100% ally in relation to everyone. I'm just me, not a card-carrying member of any Indigenous nation, but I'm loved, adopted, related to, and accepted by many, rejected by a few, haters gonna hate, relators gonna relate. I am blessed to have Indigenous relations in my family, and secretly I may love them more than the rest, only because they are the first peoples of this land who welcome all the guests. But I'm also Irish with some Scandinavian, along with a little bit of mystery, and that's the way I was raised, strongly anti-colonial and justice-oriented, with a big related heart for all. I most empathize with my Batoche Métis friends and family and that history and culture growing up, and as an adult have continued to try to live that Neopamitsuan, that beautiful good life. So from the fringes of the sash, I situate myself as a relative and an ally, and welcome you, my listeners, as brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, cousins in the Homelands. So let's welcome our relative tonight. Our guest today, I've got too many windows up here, is Clement Chartier, Clement Chartier QC, who is a Métis Canadian leader. Now, Clem served as president of the World Council of Indigenous Peoples between 1984 to 1987 and was vice president between 1993 to 97. From Buffalo Narrows, he went to the boarding school in La Crosse, Saskatchewan for 10 years. He officially became a lawyer in 1980. Now, Clem has been president of Canada's Métis National Council since the 24th of October 2003. He was president of Métis Nation Saskatchewan from 98 to 2003, turning over that office to interim president Lorna Dawkin when he became president of MNC, the Métis National Council. He announced in November 2019 that MMF Manitoba Métis Federation President David Chartrand would lead the MNC for national affairs until the council's next election and serve as the national spokesperson. He comes today as not only a lawyer and a longtime politician, but also a concerned member of Métis Nation Saskatchewan. So welcome, Clem.
Yes, thank you for the invitation.
You're very welcome. And just before we kind of get into some of the issues that you're especially concerned about, did you want to tell us a bit more about yourself, maybe things that are missing from the bio, where you came from in your journey thus far, or speak to any of that?
Well, I've had, I guess, a blessed life by being able to serve my community. I've been honored to have had elders sort of guiding me, and also not demanding, but saying what I should do to help our people correct the mistakes of the past, particularly the script process, where some of our elders said, they didn't know really what they were signing, right? And they thought land would be provided every 25 years, but they found out subsequently that no, with filling out these applications, they lost all of their land rights forever and that of their descendants. So they're saying that's something that we would like you to work on. And of course, later on, they asked me to work on hunting and fishing rights, which I did, as a lawyer, pro bono, because I'm not a practicing lawyer. I kind of do it on the side as not a hobby, but as something that needs to be done. And so I've also had the honor of serving, as you mentioned, internationally, particularly the America, South Central America, and was on the ground in many instances, including Nicaragua in 1986, where I survived a couple of aerial attacks by the Sandinista government. And so I've seen a lot of things in my life, but I also saw growing up, particularly at the boarding school, the bad treatment, I guess I could call it, that we received at the hands of the religious order. And also when I finally went out of the North, I went to the PAW for actually a year and a half. And there the racism was so rampant, was so in your face. It was a shock coming out of Buffalo Narrows, Northwest Saskatchewan, where we're the majority population. And that we're basically left to survive or to live on our own without that outward racism. But I kind of realized later that there was a bit of institutional racism because the non-Métis folk, were, the priests, the white folk were in charge of everything. But it just seemed normal because that's how we grew up. That's changed now, of course. Then I went to Regina to Notre Dame College in Wilcox for grade 12 and 3 years of university. And Regina in the late 60s was quite horrendous in terms of racism. And I think that's what kind of instilled in me, that not need, but that desire to try to help out as much I could for, our people, well, Indigenous people generally, and of course the Métis Nation specifically as I got older and realized, the struggles that our people have had in the past and the continuing struggles that we're engaged in. So that kind of formed my life view. So I never practiced law. I didn't go into private practice. I didn't apply to become a judge. I didn't apply for the job at the Native Law Center back in the late 70s when I was asked to. I thought, no, I have to stay within my own community and try to help make things better. So that's how I'm situated where I am today. And, I've run in a lot of elections. I've lost a lot, but I've also won, and I've been pleased to be able to serve, my people the way that I have.
Awesome answer. Yeah, and of course you were still honored with the QC Queen's Council designate nomination.
Well, that's mainly because of my work on the Canadian Constitution, in terms of, it's politics driving law, but nevertheless it's still law related. And I was one of the first, well, actually the first president or national representative of the Métis National Council when we formed it in March 8th, 1983. And we took the then Prime Minister to court to prevent the Constitution Conference from going ahead until the Métis were invited. And so we got an out-of-court settlement. We got one seat. And I happened to be the so-called national representative or president. And I had the privilege of signing the first amendments and only amendments to Canada's Constitution on behalf of the Métis Nation, along with the Prime Minister, the premiers, and other Aboriginal leaders. So it was a big, again, a big happening in my life. And I did go on to, as I say, when the elders in 1993, when the constitutional talks broke down, well, in 92, but with the Charlottetown Round in the fall of the Métis Nation Accord, which was a fantastic accord, which would have seen us moving, ahead rapidly. It failed, so there have been no constitutional conferences since. So we decided to turn back on our protections in Section 35, and in Northwest Saskatchewan here, the elders asked me to start defending our people who are being charged for hunting without a license or hunting out of season. And that's where my sort of active practice began in terms of the courts. And I think it's because of some of that work that I was recognized, as, material, I guess, for getting a Queen's Council designation.
Oh, that's awesome background. Yeah. And for those who aren't familiar, basically what that clause, if I'm explaining it correctly, basically meant that the Métis could sue for recognition, basically, was kind of what it came down to. You could probably explain it better though.
Well, what it is Section 35. See, when the Prime Minister Trudeau wanted to patriate the Constitution from Great Britain to Canada, because until 1982, Canada's Constitution could only be amended by the British Parliament. And Prime Minister Trudeau wanted it to be in Canada. And he started in 1971 with the Victoria Conference and was not able to do so. And finally, I think, if not in frustration, but finally putting his foot down, saying, we're going to patriate the Constitution no matter what. 8 provinces opposed, only 2 supported, Ontario and New Brunswick. And so he charged Mr. Chartier, then Minister of Justice, to travel the country and to solicit support of Canadians and of Indigenous people specifically. And on January 31, 1981, there was Chartier ready to go to the parliamentary committee or the joint committee hearing this and say, we have reached a deal with Aboriginal peoples, Indigenous peoples. And they had Section 35, which said the Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples are hereby recognized and affirmed. But we happen to have a Métis as the head of the Native Council of Canada from Regina Beach, Saskatchewan. And he said, well, that's all well and good, but we need to ensure that the Métis are included. And Chartier says, well, they are. He says, well, no, we won't give our support unless you define who are the Aboriginal peoples. So at the very last minute, Section 35.2 came in and states the Aboriginal peoples include the Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples. So we got in. But then 3 months later, we got a letter from Justice Minister Critchia in April stating that whatever Aboriginal rights and title we had were extinguished by the script system. So they say you're in, but you ain't got none. And so we knew it was a battle, but we also knew it was an opportunity. And so we continued pressing ahead, and we were being excluded from the March 1983 conference by the Native Council of Canada, which is an organization we started up in 1971, the three Prairie Métis organizations. And within 3 years, it went coast to coast to coast with non-status, status Indians, some Inuit, and the Métis became a significant minority on the board. And by 1983, when the conference was coming, we were told the 2 seats allocated to the Native Council of Canada would go to the president and vice president. The president was a non-status Indian, and the vice president was a status Indian, Bill Wilson, actually the mother of Jody Wilson Raybould. So we were totally frozen out. So we said, okay, we'll go home and we'll regroup. And so we formed the Métis National Council on March 8th, and we got our seat at the table. And we haven't looked back since, but that's where we are having problems today, because we opened our doors again too much, like they did in 1971 at the Native Council of Canada. Now there's a lot of people from Eastern Canada who aren't part of the historic Métis Nation that have, come into the Métis National Council. Now we're trying to correct that. So it's causing major rifts within the leadership of the Métis National Council as we speak today.
Yeah, and that could be a whole episode unto itself. Let's move into kind of what your concerns are with the upcoming Métis Nation Saskatchewan election.
Well, you see, this relates to the national level as well. It relates to the Métis Nation as a whole. Mm-hmm. And currently there's 5 governing members, 1 suspended, the Métis Nation of Ontario, that make up the government or governance of the Métis National Council, or the Métis Nation represented by the Métis National Council. And we're kind of in a balance. The balance is going to be determined by the election in May 29th in this province, because depending on who wins the election, it'll continue going the way, if Mr. McCallum gets reelected, it'll continue going the way it is now, with an alliance with the Métis Nation of Alberta and the suspended Métis Nation of Ontario. And the Métis National Council likely will wither on the vine. If, on the other hand, the pro-Métis Nationalist Movement Saskatchewan wins the election, then we'll be working in concert with other Métis nationalists in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And we will refortify the representative body of the Métis Nation, the Métis National Council, and we'll continue on our way, and hopefully within a few years declare the government of the Métis Nation.
Okay, and so I've got some news releases that indicate basically there's an issue with the way the election is being run in Saskatchewan. So do you want to go into that, or?
Yes, I was just taking a breath.
Actually, oh, sure, yeah.
But no, I was going to lead to that. Yeah. So the Métis movement in Saskatchewan has always been strong, relatively strong, quite strong, because we're rooted here. This is, Batoche is here. We spilled blood, Batoche. We sacrificed for over 100 years, on the prairies, including in Saskatchewan. And we're finally making progress. And again, with patriation of the Constitution in 1983, the non-status Indians, when we formed the Métis National Council, the non-status Indians in Alberta and Manitoba immediately withdrew and stayed with the Native Council of Canada. But in Saskatchewan, we had changed our name from Métis Society of Saskatchewan in 1976 to the Association of Métis and Non-Status Indians of Saskatchewan, to reflect the reality that we also had non-status Indians in our organization, because in the 60s and 70s, we had the same socioeconomic problems. And so it made sense to work together. But when it started to come down to rights and identity, we knew, and particularly with the Constitution, we knew there had to be realignments. But the realignment in Saskatchewan didn't take place immediately. In fact, in 1987 at Batoche, we passed a resolution to set up a Constitution Commission, which I ended up being the chair of, with a proposed or a set constitutional conference to be held in Prince Albert in February of 1988, which we held, but then at that time, because the constitutional conferencing process failed, there were 4 between 83 and 87, and the right of self-government was recognized. Sort of the AMSIS faction, like the president was Jim Sinclair of AMSIS, who was a non-status Indian. They felt, well, now is not the time, there's no need to separate. But we had passed a motion, we wanted to continue seeing it through because we had to be Métis only. And so the process was quite difficult. So a number of us Métis said, no, we have to continue moving forward because we'll never get what we want if we stay in one organization. And the non-status Indians will never get what they're fighting for because they'll be submerged or subsumed by the Métis struggle, which they always have been. So we have to separate and make it distinct. And so in February of 1988, we actually did adopt a new constitution. We were taken to court and we went by AMSIS executive, and we got a court-ordered referendum, August 1988. Stay together or separate ways. And the separate ways won, but not by a heck of a lot. And then we had an election in February 1989. And in both the referendum and in the first election, it was by declaration. In the referendum, you declared whether you're non-status Indian or a Métis, and you had the right to vote. And in the 89 election, you simply had the right to vote if you went to the polls and declared that you're Métis. And that happened with the subsequent ones. It was 1992, it was every 3 years. And it was in 1993 that we adopted the Constitution of the Métis Nation. Over 900 Métis gathered in Prince Albert or Saskatoon and adopted a new political constitution based on the inherent right of self-government. And that constitution has not been incorporated or entrenched anywhere in any federal or provincial law. It's a self-declared constitution under Métis law based on the inherent right of self-government under Section 35 and also under international law based on the right of self-determination. And all the elections since, we have been voting by declaration. Our constitution, the preamble says there is universal suffrage. And in the actual clauses themselves, it says any Métis has the right to vote as long as they're 16 years of age and over. And we've been doing that, and it's as a government. But this past term, the current leadership, starting about 2 years ago, based on an agreement they signed with Minister Bennett, a so-called self-government agreement, which is only an internal governance agreement to adopt a new constitution. And if the government likes that constitution, they'll pass federal legislation to give it force of law. So we've gone from an inherent right constitution based on self-government to one now that may, if it's passed, is contingent on the federal government giving it its blessing and passing legislation. And what's also happening is, about a year and a half ago, they started saying, unless you have a card, you can't get a service from the Métis Nation government. And that's translated to also, unless you have a card or have applied for one by March 30th, you can't vote in the next election. So what they've done is they've taken us from a people with the inherent right of self-government and our own government to now going towards a membership organization based on membership. And so they're denying people as well service if you don't have a card. Even during COVID, some people are telling me because they didn't have a card, they couldn't get any COVID assistance. Now, that's wrong. And I, as the president of the Métis National Council and the Manitoba Métis Federation President, David Chartrand, as our Minister of Finance and Vice President, we led the negotiations with the Prime Minister and Cabinet in terms of programs and services for our people under the April 2017 Canada Métis Nation Accord, where we were able to get the Prime Minister in December of 2016 to announce these permanent bilateral mechanism processes. And I took about 15 years, excuse me, I took about 15 years to convince governments to address us on a distinctions-based approach, First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation. Because before that, they'll say Aboriginal, but when you look behind it, zero for the Métis. And I'd rather have them say zero for the Métis than hide us in there and Canadians think we're getting something when we're not. And the Prime Minister finally did agree with me when I brought that up in December, excuse me, December of 2015 after their election, because he invited 5 national leaders And I said, no, we should only be inviting 3, the national representatives of Indigenous nations and peoples, the Assembly of First Nations, the Inuit, Tapirat, Kanatami, and the Métis National Council. And he did go with that. 3 months later, he invited just the 3 to the First Minister's Conference on Green Growth and Climate Change. And that incensed a lot of premiers, but he stuck to his grounds, and he stuck to his grounds to today. But under the permanent bilateral mechanism process and leading up to it in budget 17. Well, let me just backtrack. Budget 2016 was their first budget, and not long after they got elected. During the campaign, they said they're going to meet the Kelowna objectives, the Kelowna Accord objectives, which we negotiated. I was part of that, negotiated the Right Honorable Paul Martin. And the Métis Nation was one of the biggest winners, not in the biggest share of the $5 billion promised, but we were getting on a distinctions-based approach, a National Housing Institute, a Center of Excellence on Education, Economic Development, funding, that the whole thing that we needed as a government. But with the election of Harper and Prentice, they just scrapped it with, a cabinet minister, Monty Solberg, saying, it was just written on the back of a napkin. And the Trudeau government or party, the Liberal Party, promised to implement Kelowna, and they did in the March 2016 budget. In fact, they put $8.2 billion to the Indigenous community. But when you look behind it, it was zero for the Métis, several $100 million for the Inuit, and the rest was all First Nations. And when I had a chance to speak to the finance minister at a town hall virtual meeting, I was the last one called to speak to Clement Chartier, Buffalo Narrows, Huron. And I congratulated him and said, that's good that you met the Kelowna objectives. But there was nothing in there for the Métis. And we were in the Kelowna, and I mentioned a few things, and he was going to come back with a political answer. Then he just finally says, well, I didn't know that. And of course, nobody in the federal government is going to volunteer and say, oh, the Métis are supposed to get something, because we've been excluded for over a century. And so they said they'd work to correct that. And so in the next budget, 2017, what they did is they provided us $84 million for our internal governance for the Métis National Council and its governing members over 5 years. So over the first year, it escalated. It was 18 million. The national, we got 10%. And the governing members, we have a formula. Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba get 25%. BC and Ontario get 12.5% each. So before the last election in May of 2017, there was $4 million waiting for the newly elected government of the MNS, which is quite substantial, because in the past, the most we ever got was, 500,000 a year. So quite a substantial increase, and it's escalating. Come April the 1st, it'll be at $9 million, and then it'll be ongoing at that level. So that was a success. Then for 2018, we received $500 million for housing over 10 years, $450 million for early learning and childcare over 10 years, and 25% of that goes to the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan and other smaller amounts. In 2019, we also received about $1 billion. So over 2 budgets, we received in excess of $2 billion, the first time in the history of the Métis Nation that we've ever been included specifically in a federal budget. Very significant. And we're hoping in the next budget, we missed 2020 because of COVID. The next budget is coming up, and we put in an ask last year, and we're still pushing it to get perhaps in excess of $1 billion for healthcare, because Métis, we don't get health services from the federal government. They have the First Nations and Inuit Health Branch. That tells you everything. And so we want to get services for our elders. In fact, I was just at La Loche yesterday, where one of our elders, past local president, got a hold of me yesterday and asked me to come and see him, which I did. And he's living in this little house with sometimes no wood. He's got heart problems, got, lots of problems. And there's nobody there to help him. And so we need the federal government to start providing services to us, well, to our government, to the MNS, who can then serve our people. So it's a crying shame that a lot of our people are still living the way they are. So we're pushing that. But again, this kind of political rupture with this new tri-council, which was set up in January, a year ago, January, in Edmonton, with the Métis Nation of Ontario, the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, the Métis Nation of Alberta, the three signatories with Minister Bennett under these so-called self-government agreements are calling themselves the only recognized self-government, Métis governments in Canada. And they decided to put in their own budget ask. I don't know, we don't know what they put in, and we don't know how the federal government is going to actually respond to this, having two, separate budget asks coming in from, the Métis Nation. So that's again, a critical issue. And of course, the big problem there is, what do we do with the Métis Nation of Ontario? And that is festering. That's the wound that's festering in the nation, and it is potentially going to cripple us. And so I again say, the election on May 29th is going to be so important that it's going to determine the direction that the Métis National Council takes. And just to finish off, we're not the only ones that have the electoral system that we have. Well, the Métis Nation of Alberta has the need that you need a card to vote. And in fact, they went to the court just a couple of years ago, again, and 5 years before that, to bar some people from running that they didn't want to run against them again, and took their cards away and said, you can't run for 6 years. They were taken to court, and all the way up to the Court of Appeal in Alberta. The Court of Appeal in Alberta agreed, yes, MNA, you're right. You're just a membership organization. You can accept or reject anybody that you want. And 2 years ago, the same president in her affidavit said, if they don't like it, they can go form their own. Well, in fact, last year, Northeast Alberta, they formed their own. Now they're called the Alberta Métis Federation. So you need to have a card. In Saskatchewan, we never had to have a card. You just have to self-declare. Although it's good to be registered, we encourage people to get registered. And in Manitoba, and Alberta has about close to 40,000 registered Métis, and Manitoba has about 38,000. But in Manitoba, and I just confirmed with the chief electoral officer yesterday because I didn't want to be wrong, that yes, they also have a voters list which they publicize, but any Métis citizen in Manitoba can go and vote by declaration. Nobody's excluded. And in Manitoba, also any Métis, even if you don't have a card, will be served. Because again, like I say, 25% of the money of the $2 billion that we've gotten on behalf of MNS now is only going to those that are registered. Well, that's only maybe, if I'm generous, 20% of the Métis population in this province. So 80% are being excluded when they're citizens because they don't have a card. And the money was meant for all Métis in Saskatchewan, not just for those that have a membership card or have registered. So now in Saskatchewan, we have registered Métis citizens and non-registered Métis citizens. Only registered Métis citizens can vote and get services. Non-registered Métis citizens cannot get services and cannot vote unless we win this court case where the Constitution prevails over the legislation. The legislation was amended on February the 20th to say any registered Métis can vote. The Constitution says any Métis can vote. And they didn't change the Constitution because they need 3/4 of the MNLA, the Legislative Assembly, and 3/4 of the General Assembly to pass a constitutional amendment. And they know they couldn't do that, so they abandoned trying to do that. They were looking at it last December, but they know they couldn't. So we are relying on the courts to do the right thing and to uphold our Constitution. And if they uphold our Constitution, then any Métis in this province, 16 years of age and up, can exercise their right as a Métis citizen in this province.
Okay, that's all the time we have. So Kushi Marci, Clement Chartier tonight. Niwagamaganok, all my relations, and believe me, we are all related. So act like you've got relations. This is Auntie Andy signing out from Homelands. Originally produced on CFCR Community Radio 90.5 FM in Saskatoon, Homelands of the Métis and Treaty 6 Territory, CFCR.ca. You can also find their excellent programming on Indian and Cowboy podcasting. Follow us on Twitter at Métis Homelands or email métishomelands@gmail.com. This episode will also be viewable on our YouTube channel, Homelands. So subscribe today. Marci, thank you for listening. And Akoshi Kawapa Mitinawal Mina. That's all. We'll see you later.